Again, we're glad you're here. Will you join me in welcoming our bishop?
Thank you so much, Pastor Tim Westermeyer and the whole St. Philip the Deacon community. It's wonderful that you have so graciously welcomed us into your church home. So let's give them a round of applause. Please carry that back to your staff. I can't tell you how excited I am to welcome you all to this series of lectures on the role of government from a Lutheran perspective. We are heirs of a theologian, Martin Luther, who himself really never shied away from controversy or challenges in front of him, be they religious or political or social. Perhaps he didn't always take exactly the stand we would have hoped for, but he did not shy away from engagement. And in this moment, I think we all need courage and wisdom and insight, and we're asking our Lutheran ethicists and theologians to accompany us on this journey, to give us wisdom for this path. The Challenge of Leadership Ministering in an Election Year is a series designed to equip our rostered leaders in an era when tension and anxiety are high because of partisanship and alienation, and where the role of religion in the public square is questioned from all sides. All this, we believe, dramatically intensifies the normal, everyday challenges of being a public Christian leader. It's my hope that this series over these next months will bring you strength and courage, insight and encouragement, as well as challenge and curiosity. The theologians and ethicists who have already committed to be a part of this series are all well-versed in the topic of being a Lutheran leader in this age, and you'll hear names you will likely already know: Marty Stortz, Gary Simpson, Guillermo Hansen, and Barbara Lundblad. A list of the dates and speakers has been sent to you through the email, but also through the email. It sounded a little bit dated. Through email. But we also have printed versions available today. So please put these dates in your calendar, invite a friend or two. I think we have a real treasure in front of us. And I think it's not just the speakers, but the conversation partners that you will find in this room that will be great gifts of wisdom and strength. I want to thank especially our Synod Public Voice Committee, who have been deeply engaged in this series, being thought partners together with me and offering to handle lots and lots of logistics. So I'd like to have Dan Garnis and Anna Scott. They're here. I know they're here. Stand. I'd like to have them stand. So that, yeah, you were waiting for the second part, sorry. Would you please stand? Dan Garnis, Anna Scott, Melissa Pullman, Doug Mork, Lori Eaton, and Eva Jensen. And let us give them a round of applause. You will see them active with different responsibilities throughout this morning and throughout this series. And now it's my great honor to welcome our inaugural speaker in our lecture series, the Reverend Dr. Anthony Baptista, Assistant Professor of Religion at St. Olaf College. A few oldies in the room, perhaps? Go. Ya. He's also, in addition to Assistant Religion Professor, the Race Program Advisor at St. Olaf. He earned his Bachelor of Science degree at Iowa State University, his MDiv from Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago, and his, yes, there's another, and his PhD from Princeton Seminary in 2017. He's a specialist in Martin Luther, moral theology, and Christian ethics. Pretty good combination of insights to be our first speaker in this series. His dissertation is entitled Becoming a Living Law, Freedom and Justice in the Ethical Writings of Martin Luther. Dr. Baptista specializes in trends in critical theology, modern moral theology, and the history of doctrine. His other scholarly pursuits include the broader Augustinian tradition, the impact of Luther's thoughts on 19th century philosophy, which is also related to what we're doing today, and questions of race, identity, and social justice. He's active in the American Academy of Religion, the Society of Christian Ethics, the International Bonhoeffer Society. He's also active in the ELCA, an ordained pastor, involved in Lutheran Student Movement, the ELCA Multicultural Ministries Program, and the Martin Luther and World Lutheran Tradition Group. Curious about that. The St. Olaf faculty website says, he lives in Northfield with his wife Cynthia and 2 young children, Austin and Magdalene. In his free time, he enjoys cycling, board games, and cooking. A good threesome. So he will speak today on loving your political neighbor, lessons from Luther today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Baptista.
Thank you so much. All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to folks out there streaming from your couches or wherever you happen to be. Let me begin by saying it is a genuine pleasure to be with you all here this morning. I want to thank Bishop Ann for the gracious invitation to be a part of this important and I think timely series as we reflect on what it means to be leaders in this church in a time of great transition, great questioning about where we're going as a nation and as communities in this political body. I want to also thank Bob and Eric for various, printing requests and telling me how to get to places, because I'm trying to figure out on Google Maps where things are, so thank you for that. It is a genuine treat to be up here. I think one of the challenges we have sometimes is that we have all of these folks like myself who are trained and get these degrees and take all of these classes and then teach. And sometimes it's hard for us to figure out how to get out and share that knowledge beyond the classroom. It's hard enough to share it in the classroom sometimes, and then to figure out how you're going to get it beyond the classroom in ways that are helpful and fruitful and life-giving to yourself and to others. So I'm thankful for the opportunity to be here and do that with you this morning. What else? Yeah, it's weird to hear your bio read to you. I still feel odd about all of the things being listed, so I've got to get used to that as the years go by. So I'm going to talk to you this morning about Luther's approach to politics. Let me just preface by saying that I assume and suppose that all of you are well-educated Lutheran pastors and lay leaders of various kinds, that you have tons of training and read lots of courses. You were forced to memorize the catechism perhaps many years ago and quizzed by stern pastors staring down at you, so you don't need that kind of instruction. What I am going to do, though, is offer some of my own take, my own insights into Luther. I'm going to try and highlight some places where I think he might be useful as you're looking for ways to break into political conversations by using Luther, both as a resource and, quite frankly, to give you some cover. I think we have to be honest about the fact that as a Lutheran, if you can say, well, Luther said this, then it's kind of hard for people to push back and say, well, that's not Lutheran, and just brazenly say, well, I'm just going to hide behind the Wittenberg guy and let him take some of the heat when I put some of these things forward. Okay? And I'm going to try, I think, to model a way of approaching Luther that doesn't just lionize him and praise him as sort of the greatest thing before sliced bread. There is a tendency to do that, and there is a temptation to do that in myself as well. But I've picked sort of 3 ways of looking at Luther sort of as an ally, as sort of an ambivalent, complicated resource, and ways we might want to push back against Luther in this political climate. Places where following his example might lead us astray. Sound good? All right, so you've got about 45, 55 minutes. We're going to save questions, as I understand it, for when we're over in the small group discussion room. So if you have questions and you're afraid of losing them, make a little note to yourself. I don't want those questions to get lost. Happy to keep the conversation going after we leave this space on a more one-on-one, intimate, or group conversation basis. All right, so let's get started. You all should have a handout in front of you that gives you a basic outline of what I'm going to talk about this morning. I'll begin by saying that one of our biggest tasks is dispelling the series of myths that are out there about Luther. There are, I think, recurring ideas that Luther is sort of passive in the face of political drama and political situations, that Lutherans are engaged in a certain kind of quietism. And quite frankly, Minnesota Scandinavianness doesn't help that myth. a tendency to kind of want to go along, to want to sort of use passive aggression as the primary mode of engagement, feeds into this narrative of Lutherans being quietistic and reserved, when of course Luther was nothing of the sort. And so I think anything we can do to highlight places in Luther's thought where he is not retreating from the public sphere, but sort of charging in, sometimes blundering in, is useful for us today. So a couple points I want to make. The first is that throughout Luther's career, Luther often appealed to the demands placed upon him as a pastor of people, of communities, of congregations. That this was not something that he wanted to do when he was engaging political leaders, when he was causing issues, causing trouble, being a rabble-rouser. That he really felt that his hands were tied, and not just in the here I stand, I can do no other sense, but in the sense of I can't block out the cries and the sounds of people demanding that something happen, that something change. Okay? So I have one little quote here from Luther to the Christian Nobility, which might seem familiar to you if you've read that piece a time or two, where Luther says, "It is not from sheer impertinence or rashness that I, one poor man, have taken it upon myself to address you worshippers. All the estates of Christendom, particularly in Germany, are now oppressed and by distress and affliction. And this has stirred not only me, but everybody else to cry out time and time again, to pray for help. It has even compelled me now at this time to cry aloud that God may inspire someone with the Spirit to lend a helping hand to this distressed and wretched nation." Okay? Now, again, you could argue, sort of cynically, that Luther's just trying to cover his butt, that he's going to be seen as this backwater German friar or monk who is causing trouble, and so he's trying to say, oh, I wish I could do otherwise, but here I have to listen to people's cries. But I take Luther to be quite genuine and serious in this kind of language. Scott Hendricks, a noted Reformation scholar, often talks about one of the uniting themes of Reformation folks being this idea that it was their task to recultivate the vineyard, sort of the language that he uses, that they saw themselves as having this burden, this obligation, this duty placed upon them to go out there and till the soil, to clear the weeds, to get the ground ready again, and they sort of felt compelled into this job and this responsibility. And I don't know how often pastors feel that, quite honestly. I'll have some airing of my grievances at the very end of my talk, so I'll save some of that for later. But oftentimes when I hear pastors talking about getting involved or making political statements or taking stands from the pulpit or in Christian education, there's sort of a reticence or a fear of the people turning against them, as opposed to saying, I'm doing this because the people are demanding it. And Luther was very clear that he was compelled. Now, Luther didn't think that he had all the solutions. Some of the time. Some of the time he did. But as a general rule, as we see here in the quote that I lifted from to the Christian Nobility, Luther is pretty clear that he just needs to sound the clarion call, right? That he needs to ring the bell, he needs to inspire other spirits, be these princes, be these other rulers, be these folks in parishes and in pews. He doesn't know exactly what shape this is going to take, but he knows he has to say something. Which to me is very much permission-giving to those standing in pulpits, standing in congregations, standing with communities. That you don't have to sort of give out policy decisions and procedures. You don't need to prognosticate about the future of your community or a political body. But you do need to ring the bell and do it loudly and clearly and let others join in how they see fit. So Luther appealed to the people's cries. There's also a common myth, and I hear more of this in Minnesota than I did in Chicago. I think it's a theological and cultural thing. But there is a myth or a fear that if you start preaching politics and getting involved in these issues, you're going to be violating the law-gospel distinction, you're going to be mixing the two kingdoms, you're going to be confusing the estates. I remember having all these things drilled into me in seminary, and I've heard that it gets drilled in even more in these parts, at least, again, these are my gatherings from conversations of past seminary classes and other luminaries and ghosts in the back of your minds from those days. So I pulled a quote here that is from one of my favorite works by Luther. It's from his commentary on Psalm 101, which he wrote in 1534, give or take. And it's a mirror for princes. He wrote it as sort of an instruction on how princes should lead their lives. And he's gone on in this work for many, many pages, working through Psalm 101, expounding upon what David was like as a ruler, how he was both an upright and righteous man in God's eyes, and he was a wonderful ruler, did everything great, etc., etc. So Luther's going on and on and on, as was his practice. And then he pauses for a moment, and he says, well, I feel like at this point somebody's going to throw back in my face all this stuff I say about the kingdoms and the law gospel. He's like, I feel like you're going to push back on me and say I'm breaking the rules that I established. So he responds by saying this. Now, if a preacher in his official capacity says to kings and princes and to all the world, thank and fear God and keep his commandments, he is not meddling in the affairs of secular government. On the contrary, he is thereby serving and being obedient to the highest government. For with respect to God and in the service of God's authority, everything should be identical and mixed together, whether it be called spiritual or secular, every one of them helping the other to be obedient. So again, if you're used to hearing that Luther demands these distinctions be rigid and kept with utmost purity, it's surprising to see him say, yeah, sometimes you just got to mix it all together, right? When it comes to how government is going to be run, when it comes to how politicians are behaving, it doesn't matter if you're a pastor, if you're a layperson, if you're in government, if you're outside of government, wherever you find yourself, you have the right and authority to speak up and offer your counsel. Now, he doesn't think you can seize control of the government, right? So put the pitchforks and the torches away if that was your plan for 2020 political engagement. But you can yell as loud as you want about what you want to happen, right? You're not storming the gates and taking over the place, but you're going to stand outside the gates and yell and demand that you be heard over and over again, and have no fear of mixing your responsibility as priest, pastor, and person in this political body, okay? Luther certainly didn't pull the gloves off. Okay, so Luther is not a quietist, and Luther is not quite as afraid about mixing the kingdoms and the estates and law and gospel as some would have us to believe. Okay? So, point 2. Perfect. I'm laying out here what I'm calling sort of 3 groupings, positive, ambivalent, and negative examples from Luther's theology. Insights or observations that I've made that, again, I hope are helpful for you as you think about how to guide your own work and your congregations and communities in thinking about politics this year. Let's begin with the positive stuff. The first thing I have to begin with, because we are Lutherans, is the centrality and fundamental importance of justification for our identity and our lives. Now, there are, I think, better and worse ways to do this. The worst way to do it, the way that I sometimes encounter, is people saying that because we are justified, we are Christ's and Christ's alone, that our identity is grounded in our baptism, so these other identities aren't as important. Right? That may not be you. I don't know who's doing what in what parishes. I only get to so many and so many Sundays. But I've heard no shortage of those kinds of sermons. To me, that strikes my ears as sort of the same approach to racism that we call colorblind racism. It's this sort of justification means we're all the same, we're all equal in God's eyes. So any other identities or distinctions that you're bringing into your life, those should be seen as secondary and not as important, and just, put those to the side when you're in this holy and religious space. I think that's the opposite of the way that we should be going with these things. Right? Because our identity is secured in Christ, in baptism, and what God has done in Jesus 2,000 years ago and keeps doing at these tables, we have the fear, we don't have any fear when embracing other aspects of our identity and letting others do the same. I think there is, as I observe, a growing wariness in some camps about identity politics. About people sort of bringing too many identities and leaning on those identities for political reasons and in political conversations, and fear of offending people across identity boundaries and identity distinctions. I think Lutherans should be the least people afraid of that as a possibility. Because you have this grounding and foundation in what Christ has done, then feel free to bring whatever identities related to your race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, occupation, if you're a knitter or not, whatever it is that's really important to how you define and understand yourself, you should feel free to organize yourself around that identity in some way, to bring your perspective and your context to bear on how you're thinking about God and politics. And Lutheran churches should be, the safest place to do that. Because that's not how we understand ourselves being related to God. Okay? All right. So there is space for political identities and different kinds of identities because our foundation is assured in Christ. The second thing I think is an important lesson from Luther's theology is the fundamental value of government and the political. Now, Luther never tired of bragging about this. Right? He constantly pointed out the fact that before him, as he saw it, the government was devalued. Nobody really cared about government. The Pope in Rome and all the bishops didn't really see political engagement and secular rulers as nearly as important on the order of being and the hierarchy of value as they were as church leaders and ecclesial leaders. And now Luther has kicked open the door and a new day has dawned. But I think there's some truth to that. A lot of political theorists, despite Luther's own tendency to brag on these issues, will point to the Reformation as a turning point in modern history, in the establishment of liberal democracies, whatever fears you have about secularism and the devaluing of church and society. Luther started that trend for a reason. Right? He wanted people to see just how fundamental and how valuable government was for all people. So, for example, as he says here in one of his sermons from 1530, he says, "Temporal peace is the greatest good on earth. In this, all other temporal goods are also included." Okay? Now, Luther's peace here doesn't mean the absence of conflict. Right? It doesn't mean like sitting on your couch watching Netflix and then we're all okay because nothing's happening. But obviously, peace here for Luther means the absence of violence, of chaos, of people having to be afraid of what's going to happen in their realm, to their neighbors, and to themselves. Okay? Now, if we take Luther's admonition to peace, not necessarily the treatise itself, but his admonition to embrace peace, and we hold that up against the world around us, I think it's pretty clear to see that people in our congregations, our community, and our country don't feel at peace right now. I mean, maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm okay. Some nods or something to, yeah, okay. My Facebook feed hopefully looks like your social media feeds as well, that there is a consistent sense of anxiety about what's going to happen next, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, what candidate you're supporting. I think folks feel a real sense that they can't predict and can't anticipate what's going to happen from one day to the next. Is a tweet going to change our foreign policy? Are the socialists going to rise up and take everything from us? There's just this persistent sense of fear. Okay? Now, we can answer those fears by replying with sort of facts and data and that kind of thing. But I think we have to recognize what happens when people feel a lack of peace and how quickly then they are sucked up by folks who want to promise false peace and easy answers and assurance. And Luther was acutely aware of this. When people are afraid, when they're terrified, when they're worried, they'll quickly follow someone who's going to lead them to some perhaps pretty disastrous ends. Cross-reference Luther's admonition to peace and the German Peasants' War. Okay? He had some real reservations about that. So, if we are engaging in political conversations in our congregations and in our communities, then one thing we can lift up is the value of peace and highlight how people are not at peace in real, genuine political and economic ways. For Luther, this doesn't mean like spiritual peace. I've heard a number of sermons on how the sort of existentialist interpretation of Luther, like we should be at peace at our souls and know we're in peace with Christ. That's all important. I'm not saying that's not important. Don't tell my bishop that I'm not saying that's not important. But for Luther, that also means peace in a real, genuine political and economic sense. Right? That people need to have some firm foundation in their vocation, in their neighborhoods, in their communities, between themselves and their neighbors. And so our preaching and our teaching in congregations should highlight ways that people feel threatened. People feel the chaos sort of creeping in around them. And how are we addressing that as a genuine, heartfelt reality and trying to dispel and address those genuine emotions and worries? My next point that I think is important from Luther's theology and his inheritance that we definitely want to carry forward is pretty close to some of my research areas, and that's the shift that we see in Luther and in a lot of Protestants who follow Luther, away from thinking about virtues and the cultivation of virtue in this life as something that increases your sanctification towards justification, virtue ordered to being made right with God, to a reorientation of virtue being ordered towards being made right for your sisters and brothers and people gathered around you. The bishop mentioned my interest in 19th century philosophy. One of the figures I really enjoy is a guy named Hegel. You might have heard of him, but may not have read him. If you might have read him, you certainly didn't understand him. That's my experience. But one of the things I love about what Hegel and other thinkers in this tradition do is they look back to Luther and say, for so long, virtue was tied up to what people did with their genitals. It was all kind of like sex-based and getting right with God. And Luther said, let's talk more about justice and the community chest and educating young women and young men, et cetera, et cetera. He sort of took the language of virtue and made it less vertical and more horizontal. Okay? And so one of my hopes is that Lutheran congregations can be places that are willingly and excitedly talking about how we are cultivating souls, creating virtues, cultivating virtues, building good habits for folks to go out and serve their communities politically. Right? How are we training folks to be good mayors, good congresspeople, good school board members, good citizens, more broadly considered? Okay? One of the places I think that you can easily do this is notice how Luther's interpretation of the Lord's Prayer and the exhortation to or the request, the petition for our daily bread, takes on a different connotation in Luther's thought. So we see here, as I have on the bottom of page 1, Luther, when interpreting the petition, says, to put it briefly, this petition includes everything that belongs to our entire life in this world, because it's only for the sake that we need daily bread. Now, our life requires not only food and clothing and other necessities for our body, but also peace and concord in our daily activities, associations, and situations of every sort with the people among whom we live and with whom we interact. In short, in everything that pertains to the regulation of both our domestic and our civil or political affairs. Okay? I don't think people hear this message enough from Christians of a variety of types. Lutherans, I know we like to talk about how supportive we are of benevolence for our Synod. We like to talk about how much benevolence we send on to Lutheran Social Services, World Hunger Appeal, these kinds of things. But I don't think we talk enough about just how expansive Luther's understanding of daily bread is, and how that includes things like maybe healthcare, immigration policy, education policy broadly construed, not just scholarships for students, but kind of how housing costs are tied to property values, the histories of those, just the real nitty-gritty, dirty sort of stuff that you need to pay attention to at local and national levels. To see all of that as wrapped up in the Lord's Prayer, right? To see all of that wrapped up in this petition to ask for daily bread, again, makes the political seem, I think, more real and more urgent to a lot of people. Okay? So, as you also, of course, know, Luther was deeply concerned in shifting our focus from ourselves and shifting our focus toward our neighbor. So as he writes here in On Temporal Authority, another one of his early texts, he says, just as one performs all other works of love which one does not need, you do not visit the sick in order that you may be made well, or feed others because you need food. So one serves the governing authority, not because you need it, but for the sake of others, that they may be protected, and that the wicked may not become worse. End quote. So I was recently rereading a work by Robin DiAngelo. She's an author who works in the area of white fragility. Hopefully it's a topic you've heard or have done some reading on or seen scattered about. If not, we can talk more about that later. But in DiAngelo's book on white fragility, she highlights the fact that at one point in her adult life, she realized that when people talked about multiculturalism and diversity and inclusion and these kinds of things, they often talked about it as if doing this would be some sort of addition to her life, right? That it was a positive thing. So you go out there, you get some diversity, you meet some people of different cultures, meet people of different communities. This is going to expand your world. This is going to be something that adds to you. She said what she never heard people talk about, and she came later to realize, is no one approached the lack of diversity itself as already a problem, as already a deficit. So the idea was we're already kind of okay, right? Sort of in our white world, in a white bubble. And if we add some diversity, that's going to be, gravy, icing on the cake. And not approaching the reality of whiteness and of our being trapped in whiteness as already being sort of stuck in a cave or stuck in a hole and having to dig your way out to even ground and to level places. My sense is that sometimes Lutheran congregations talk about political engagement and service in the world in a similar way. Right? That like us getting involved politically would be a nice additional thing that we do. Wouldn't it be great if we got engaged? It would get the kids would show up. Right? The kids love that kind of stuff. They eat it up. We'll get the kids involved, and maybe we'll get like a story in the local paper, and it'll really help those people. We'll go do those things. We'll help the people. This will be a great thing. The baseline assumption being that we kind of got things under control here. We're doing all right. We just need to sort of kick it up a notch. Instead of saying that our lack of political engagement and our lack of political conversation is genuinely a lack, that there's something wrong with us right now, right? Something that requires repentance, something that requires some sort of repair, something that requires us to be reconciled better to our tradition and to those around us. So again, talking about how it is we engage in politics and engage in our communities and action and organizing in all kinds of ways as making up for a loss that we have recognized and come to see in ourselves. Okay? Not extracurricular work. All right, a couple more points. I front-loaded the things that I liked about Luther because I can't help myself. A couple more positive points I want to make about what Luther, I think, might offer all of us as we think about engaging in political leadership and guiding communities this year. Point D I have here, I'm going to talk about but didn't give any quotes, was on the dangers of flattery and dishonest political leaders. So when I started working on my dissertation, it felt like maybe 50 years ago, but it wasn't that long ago. When I started working on my dissertation, I was initially struck by these comments that Luther keeps making in his letter to Pope Leo X that is attached in front of Freedom of a Christian. So it's almost as long as the treatise itself, and it's this long sort of letter. And then I started noticing other comments that match the ones in this letter to Pope Leo, where Luther goes on and on complaining about how everyone is flattering the Pope and flattering the princes, and he is not going to do that. And at first I took his comments to sort of be throwaway lines, like you would say to somebody like, other people aren't going to tell you the truth, but I'm going to be honest. Right? Bangs are not working for you. Right? Something like that. Those sort of moments when you want to pull someone aside, right, and say like, nobody else is going to tell you this, but I need to just be honest with you in this moment. Okay? So I thought it was that sort of like rhetorical kind of move in Luther. But the more I looked at it and the more I sort of dug around in Luther's works, I came to see it in all kinds of places and connected to his understanding of the importance of honesty and good counsel in order to have good citizens and good political leadership. Now I started doing all of this work, was it back in like 2012? 2013, 2014, as I was getting into the dissertation and writing more. And then, not to be partisan, But after 2016 and the election of Donald Trump, it seemed a little bit more pressing than I had even realized when I was digging around in these texts alone in my library carrel for many hours a day. That I think Luther was really onto something that I think we perhaps need to be onto again. That when political bodies and political leaders surround themselves with people who are just going to tell them the things that they want to hear, Luther says they become sort of immunized against criticism. Right? And he says, quoting ancient Roman sources, that a flatterer is the most dangerous thing in a government. Right? Insurrection is its own kind of danger, but when there's no insurrection, when there's no sort of rebellion, anything's close second, and the most dangerous thing in times of peace is going to be flatterers. Folks who are going to ingratiate themselves, who are going to sort of sidle up to presidents and mayors and congresspeople and say, you know, what you're doing is great. No, you are the smartest person. No, you don't need to listen to anybody else. Right? Because of how sinful we are. We love to hear that kind of stuff, right? We love to hear, oh yeah, I am pretty great. All my students do love me, you're right. So if a student says they don't love me, well, whatever. Like, I know all my students love me because this other student said that was true, and I like that better. Right? So I think what is lacking in many of our political conversations and what a lot of people are hungry for is somebody to demand, again, that truth is important. And that truth often means saying things that are uncomfortable and are risky and dangerous. And that we as leaders in the church are going to be people who are going to take a stand and demand that truth with a capital T, however you want to read that, needs to be front and center. I need to be held accountable to the things that I say and the way that I say them. Okay? Now, I don't think that any of you are out there talking to people in the parishes and in the communities about how truth isn't important. But I think there's a danger to approaching political conversations in ways that try to be so even-handed and so sort of milquetoast about things that it's not quite clear what your stand you're taking. It's not that you're afraid of truth necessarily, but you're afraid of offending. At least I know I am. I mean, I'm projecting my own sort of Iowa Midwesternness onto you. But there is a fear of giving offense, a fear of causing trouble, and people pick up on that, as opposed to sort of making demands that I'm going to state what I think the truth is, and I'm going to listen to you when you push back on me. Okay? So how is it that we are criticizing and calling out flattery and pointing to its dangers in our political lives, in our congregational lives, and our community lives? How many folks are taking a stand when senators, congresspeople, presidents, and others blatantly contradict themselves? Right? Again, that's not necessarily a partisan thing from Luther's point of view. You're just saying that rulers have to be accountable to the things they say, they have to be somewhat coherent across the years, and they have to be accountable to some pushback on claims of what's true and what's not. And you can't just call things fake news if you don't like them. Okay? Again, Donald Trump, I think, makes a easy target for this. Just, again, not trying to be too partisan here, but it's hard to avoid some of the issues he's run into with flattery and all of the claims about fake news. I'm just going to put that out there. Of course, the same charge would apply to liberals, to independents, to all kinds of other, to Greens, whatever party you're a part of. Luther thinks the danger is going to be there once you get too close to power and people get too close to you. Okay? Final point, something I think is important and valuable, worth taking with us from Luther's heritage. And this is the importance of moving people's hearts. So, a number of people that I deeply care about have continued to help make me aware of the importance of climate change, right, and the global crisis we're all facing. I'm not going to debate with you the science of that. I have a science degree. Those things are settled. We can debate policies about how to achieve that, but that it's a thing, yeah, we're done with that. So, that said, what people who are, I think, deeply concerned about climate change have come to realize in their work is that just giving people more science, like pointing to charts and graphs, and God bless Al Gore's heart, standing on a little ladder that goes up as you watch graphs climb, that's kind of interesting, but nobody seems to be energized or moved by that. One of Luther's most important insights, and this is some of the research by a scholar named Brigitte Stolt, who's done some of this work. A couple of our articles are in English, some of the stuff is in German. But she's really highlighted that for Luther, there is this constant attention to moving people's hearts, right? That affect and emotion are often overlooked as important sites for political engagement and political conversation. That people need to feel things in their splagna, in their guts, right, if they're going to take action. So I think that as Lutherans, as a part of this heritage, where we stand with a guy who loved to move people's hearts, to get their blood pumping, and who was always, a few ticks away from a heart attack himself in many moments, we need to sort of recapture some of that energy and that importance of moving people's hearts. And we don't want to undervalue the fact that we ourselves stand in just the best position to move hearts. Right? We have more or less captive audiences week in and week out. Right? We've got the groups coming in the morning for breakfast and coffee. I have fond memories of hanging out with the men's group on my internship. It was a lot more prostate conversations than I expected. I'm not gonna lie, I was like 22 and I was like, okay, I guess I'll plan ahead for that. So sometimes those places are just kind of fellowship fun places, or people having all kinds of conversations about life, family, children, and recent medical procedures. But there are also places we can leverage to tell stories and capture hearts. Right? It's the pulpit, but it's also the coffee hour conversations, the Christian education hours. It's getting folks to see themselves as storytellers, as sort of vision casters, in ways that are going to move people's affects, their guts, their emotions, to want to respond to these issues. Okay? Now, a lot of people get this in the media. And in fact, in some ways, some media outlets are leaning more into just moving emotions than they are to moving minds and beliefs. But I think we can't undervalue and can't undersell just how huge it is to cultivate people's emotions, to be attentive to feel angry in the right kind of ways at the right reasons, to feel sad in the right ways and for the right reasons, to recognize that their fragility might be the appropriate response to a situation, it might be the wrong response in this situation. One of the examples related to white fragility there comes from D'Angelo as well. She has an entire chapter in her book entitled White Women's Tears, where she talks about, in her experience, trying to talk about anti-racism work and the need to dismantle white supremacy usually elicits one of two responses in white audiences. In white men, her experience has been that it tends to elicit aggression, kind of a, no, that's not me. I was with LBJ, or whatever. I love all of these things. I'm not a racist. Back off. Don't say that to me. It's a lot of chest pounding, a lot of gorillas in the mist kind of activities. But she says for women, the tendency has not been to do that. It's not been her experience. It tends to be a lot of tears. Okay? Now, she's not saying that tears are a bad thing, that emotions are bad, but that they can be weaponized or used in ways that distract people from addressing the issues at hand. So in a situation where you're discussing the dangers and problems of white supremacy, microaggressions in our congregations and our communities, someone starts crying, then everyone's attention turns to that person. And the folks of color, the folks who feel marginalized, attention shifts away from them. Suddenly they've made somebody cry and they're the bad person. Right? Or they're too angry because they're raising these issues. And so the more and more we give attention to how it is that emotions are shaped by our lives and congregations, and how emotions are necessary for us to engage politically in the right kinds of ways, I think the better off we'll be trying to lead our congregations this year and beyond. All right, I've gone on at length about things that I think are important in Luther's thought and things I hope you resonate with your own sense of where you are in your congregations, what you might draw on as potential resources. I have a couple other categories here. The next one being things that are, my water might need cleaning up, apologies there. Things in Luther that I think are ambivalent. So my greatest example here is my concerns with how Luther approaches law and government in some of his writings. the question I put here is government a necessary evil that works to restrain and not to instruct? Question mark. So as we read here, also from On Temple Authority, which I quoted above, Luther says, without government and the sword, people would, quote, devour one another, seeing that the whole world is evil and that among thousands there is scarcely a single true Christian. No one could support spouse and child, feed oneself, and serve God. The world would be reduced to chaos. Now, where temporal government or the law alone prevails, there sheer hypocrisy is inevitable, even though the commandments be God's very own. So, my concern here with Luther's approach is that sometimes he works in too stark of a binary. He's trying to drive home the importance of the gospel and how the gospel is so different than our normal experiences of laws and obligations and burdens in our lives, that he wants to just really hammer what the sense of freedom before God and the gospel tastes like and feels like, versus what the sense of sort of duty and obligation and falling short often feels like in our day-to-day lives. Okay? It's important to hammer that distinction. But read in the wrong way, you get the impression sometimes from Luther that even though he says he praises government and wants to lift government up, he sees government as the best thing we have in a pretty horrible world. Right? A good prince is a rare bird. And without the sword, people are just going to start murdering and stabbing everybody tomorrow afternoon. Okay? It's the sort of thing you see in a lot of like dystopian television and movies these days. There's like some sort of projection that like 10 years later, we're all wearing like garbage cans and carrying like baseball bats with nails in them because, left to our own devices for a few minutes, it's all tooth and claw and bloodshed and that kind of thing. And I think that generates a bit of a tension in trying to see government as a positive place where people are actually being instructed and formed to be better citizens and maybe even to be better Christians, right? That lawyers aren't all dirty and bad, that judges have an important role to play, that serving your government in a variety of ways, through the military, through local service, the fire department, police department, all these kinds of things, these can be seen as valuable and not just restraints on murderers and criminals, but as ways of getting us to think about how we live together, what it means to share in the common good, and how we discuss that in a pluralistic world. Right? These are things I think Luther just didn't quite get a handle on sometimes. Right? Luther is here drawing upon sort of a complicated Augustinian legacy, I say. There's this famous example from Augustine in his major work, The City of God, which is quite long. But in Book 19, he's trying to make the case that happiness in its fullest form isn't really found in this life. We're sort of pilgrims on a journey, and happiness is to be found with God in the life to come. And to make this point, he sort of highlights the difficulty of being a judge. And in his time, trials weren't like sort of law and order, clean-cut sort of things. They generally involved physical torture of some kind. You were sort of beaten until you confessed or until they were satisfied that you hadn't done it and weren't going to confess. Okay, so it was a pretty brutal system. Although, aside, one might argue that some of our own current policies and prisons and things are also pretty brutal, but I'll save that for a different talk. I'm invited back next time. So, in Augustine's time, it was very difficult and a very different system. Nevertheless, Augustine paints this picture of what is the Christian to do. The Christian has to serve and be a judge because they know that judges are needed. Yet the Christian is now implicated in a system where people are being tortured, being arrested who aren't actually guilty, being sent to prison or executed who might have been innocent the whole time. The guilty are getting off. What are you going to do in that situation? And he's like, you certainly wouldn't call that person happy, would you? So I think there is some truth to that. Right? There is a recognition that this life is messy and complicated. Ambiguous is the soft way of putting it. That if you are serving in the government, you are going to find yourself probably making compromises on things you hadn't anticipated. You're going to find yourself losing some of the convictions you thought you came in charging through the door with. just like all of you have experienced as deacons and pastors and bishops. Right? That some things are going to have to change and things are going to be more difficult, perhaps, than you anticipated. Nevertheless, I think we can't let this ambiguity and this reality of these harsh experiences let us shift into or dabble into excessive cynicism and despair about what is possible through political engagement. Okay? All right. My last point on resourcing Luther concerns a place where I think Luther goes wrong, and it might be helpful for us to name the way that he goes wrong. This is another one of those that has become clearer to me in the last couple of years in our current political climate. Have any of you seen or had someone forward to you a link to the Martin Luther insult generator? Some nodding heads, people have seen this. If you haven't seen it, it's a website. It's like a website you go to. And you sort of click on a button, and it just sort of spits out from Luther's works various insults that he would cast at all kinds of people, anybody, friends, former friends, rulers, people he never met before. There's a whole host of them. There's no shortage of it. He had lots of ink and lots of parchment. Okay? So you click this button and just fires these things out. I find this quite amusing, as many people do. One of the amusing ones here, I have here from his letter, Dear Hansfust. He says, "You say, what comes out of our mouth must be kept. I hear it. Which mouth do you mean? The one from which the farts come? You can keep that yourself. You are a crude ass, and an ass you will remain." End quote. I can say that because I'm quoting Luther. So again, it just gives you all the kind of cover you need. Okay? Luther loved to call people asses, donkeys, apes, farts, and other scatological comments that I won't indulge in out of respect for our hosts and people watching at home. So there's a part of me that thinks that's funny, right? Like I kind of love it, and they seem kind of like, there are a lot of like quaint kind of peasant images of things he wants to happen to people who are like farmers and hurting themselves and all these kinds of things. But there's a part of that that's also quite dangerous, particularly in our current political environment. We have people ready to demonize others at a moment's notice. To come up with fun little nicknames that belittle people around them, people sort of turning on each other to try and secure a nomination, throw each other under the bus, all that kind of stuff. And so I think that as Lutherans, with this Lutheran heritage and this Lutheran burden, we can use Luther as an example for people in the parish and say, look what Luther did in the 16th century. It's kind of amusing, but also isn't it quite dangerous for us today? Do we need to do better than Luther did? Do we need to go beyond where Luther went? And I think the answer is unequivocally yes. As Peter Matheson, a scholar who's done some work on these issues, he says that Luther, quote, took a strange, defiant pleasure in provoking his critics to still more inarticulate rage, such that hostility and conflict became, quote, an end in themselves. Right? I would say that Luther became indulgent sometimes with his desire to castigate others. Sometimes he was lashing out as kind of a wounded animal himself. And yes, there were different standards back then for how this worked, but I think we need higher standards today. As an alternative, I would say that we need to focus on something that Luther isn't always as good at focusing on and became more of an interest in the modern period, was this idea of tolerance as a virtue. What do I mean by that? Well, tolerance is something that has kind of fallen on hard times for a lot of people. If I asked my wife on Valentine's how she thought our marriage was going, and she said, "Oh, I tolerate you," I recognize some truth in that, but I also would find that to be a pretty bad way to go for Valentine's. It would be a harsh moment. So sometimes the language of tolerance conveys just sort of going along and putting up with someone who is different than me. But traditionally, the language of tolerance as a virtue actually has a much deeper and I think more important meaning. A different way of understanding tolerance is enduring in a relationship in the midst of objectionable difference. So enduring in a relationship in the midst of objectionable difference. What that means is that I need to call upon this virtue of tolerance when I recognize something about you that I disagree with. something that I can't simply ignore, right? There are all kinds of disagreements, like your new bangs, that I might decide just aren't worth raising. They're issues I don't care about. You might be a New England Patriots fan. I find deep issues with that, but I'm going to let it go most of the time. Okay? So there are all kinds of things that we just sort of put up with that don't require tolerance. They're just sort of desiderata, insignificant things scattered about that we're not concerned about. But occasionally we'll run into differences where these are things that I really care about. Right? These are things that I think are passionate and central to my identity, to my views on our society, and my views on our church. And yet, I want to still be in relationship with you. I could exit. Right? Sometimes we have to exit. Sometimes we run into objectional differences in congregations, in relationships, in families. We have to say, I can't go on in this. I can't actually patiently endure what's happening. Other times, we do. Right? We find ways to endure. We talk to those relatives on the other side of the political spectrum. We reach out to our parents even though we feel they've wronged us in various ways. We have to carry on and find ways to do that. And so what I'll say about tolerance is that it's actually a lot more work than people give it credit for being. It's not kind of an indifference, but it's a cultivated activity. It's hard. I find it much easier to walk away from folks I disagree with than to sort of keep going on. The second thing I'll say here is that it also requires me to know that we have something we disagree about. Right? So I have to be clear about where I stand on issues before we can even know that we have a disagreement. And if I'm not clear about where I stand and not giving you space to also describe where you stand on issues, then I'll never know if we have a disagreement or not. And we'll just keep going on in this middle gray space. We're trying to guess how each other feel about things. My wife and I do that a lot. There's a sort of a tendency to I'm not going to raise this issue. I'm just going to assume what she thinks about this, and I'm going to find out one way or the other if I was right or not. It's a fun game where you're trying to guess the number in my mind or guess what I'm thinking. It's not a fun game. So instead of playing that game with our parishioners and with the folks we're in relationship with, we can just tell people where we stand on things and be open to them disagreeing with us and saying, I'm not going to let this disagreement undermine the commitment we have and the relationship we have. Okay? All right. Tolerance. I'm getting low on time. Let me close then with what I called my last section here. I was originally going to call this the airing of the grievances, as sort of a Seinfeld reference. If any of you know Festivus, there's a moment where there's the airing of the grievances. This is my chance to air some grievances, or as I'm calling it here, make some stray observations. Take these with a grain of salt. I feel like I'm on steadier ground and I'm making observations about Luther. I've done a lot of reading there, and as a scholar I feel ready to go and I have books behind me. But these are just my observations and counsels, so take them that way. So the last 9-10 years of my life, I haven't been actively leading a congregation. I do supply preaching, I do adult ed series, I come to things at Synod events, I do all that kind of stuff. But most Sundays, I'm sitting on a pew, I'm always on the right side, I have this thing where I have to always be on the right, it's weird, I don't know what it is. I sit on the right side with my family, my kids are listening maybe to the sermon or reading a book or drawing or whatever. So I'm sitting in the pews now, and I'm trying to turn off the pastor part of my brain that's taking notes during the sermon and writing a better sermon in my mind. So you all do it, don't act like I'm the only one. Trying to turn that off, but also trying to think about what is it that I'm noticing now that I'm sitting in the pew more than I'm standing behind the pulpit. And what are some things that I, as somebody, kind of want to hear and feel as I'm sitting in the pew, but also recognizing I know a little bit about what it's like to be on the other side and to be engaged in these people and these topics. So these are where these observations are coming from. My first question is based on worship, education, and service activities in your congregation. Would someone know that an election is coming? So just imagine, thought experiment, somebody just came out from a cave, right, where they didn't have any newspapers, they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have cable news. It sounds great, I know. So they've been in this cave, and they wander into your church for a week, not just Sunday, they come, the whole week, various activities. In that week, would they in some way learn or find out that this community that you're embedded in and a part of is getting ready for primaries, for debates, for an election? Right? What explicit signs, clues, and moments are there where you're pointing to and acknowledging the election? Right? I don't know that that's happening. Some places it is. Other places, a couple of comments here and there might creep up in a sermon, kind of obliquely. But are there moments and spaces you're creating intentionally and explicitly where you're saying, an election's coming? People need spaces to come and talk about these things. Hey, look, we have a lot of space. Right? Real estate is something we have buckets of. Real estate and coffee. So are we creating spaces where folks are thinking about explicitly themselves as voters and political animals? Okay. Challenge or question 1. 2, do you model naming objectionable differences, or do you assume that people in the congregation will figure it out, or that some know where you stand while others do not? So I know we're not supposed to be partisan. I get that. There are both theological, sociological, and tax implications tied up to all of that, and all of that is well and good. But my experience of many Lutheran leaders, clergy, lay, and otherwise, has often been that they assume the congregation kind of knows where they stand on things without ever saying where they stand on things, for fear of offending people or for fear of people feeling swayed by them as pastors or deacons or whatever, saying, this is what I think about X, this is where I stand. I'm not saying you bring your ballot and you show folks who you voted for the last 10 elections. But speaking sort of concretely and from the heart about where you stand on important political issues of the day as a way of inviting conversation, not demanding acquiescence from the folks in the pews and the folks around you. Do you do that, or do you assume people just they know I'm kind of purpley, right? They know I'm like a fiscal conservative, but a liberal on social issues. Doesn't mean that, of course, they get that. They probably don't. Right? I've had many difficulties in my life trying to figure out where pastors I know stand on issues. Be they pastors who are leading the congregations I'm a part of, pastors who are friends of mine from seminary. It's sometimes just hard to know where people are, and we make a lot of assumptions. And I think that in the face of those assumptions, people run in wildly different directions. Okay? I also want to say, I add on to this, taking a stand on some issues does not require taking a stand on every issue. This is something that was drilled into me by now Bishop Craig Satterley back in the day when I was learning to preach, and still learning how to do that. But when I was learning that back at LSTC, he would harp on us for the sermons that ended up being litanies of things that you wanted to address. So you just sort of rattle off, sexuality, and then there's war, and there's hunger, and all the needs of the world. Well, we hit 12 minutes, I'm going to sit down, cool. Right? You don't need to take a stand on every issue, but you need to model what it's like to take a stand on some issues. That might be the environment for you as an important voting issue. It might be white supremacy. It might be misogyny. It might be transphobia. It might be whatever. But I hope there's one or two issues that are deep to your heart and important to you, that are politically charged. Right? Not just we should feed people who are hungry. That's not politically charged enough for people to see how you're going to model what tolerance looks like and having civil discourse is going to look like. You have to take a stand on a couple of issues that are going to make some people uncomfortable. You have to model for them what it's like to do that in ways that invites relationship and doesn't shut it down. All right. Next point. Do we fall into the narrative of decline in ways that leave people in the pews wondering why they are still sitting there? My experience of sometimes clergy As you're looking at the attendance numbers going down, you're sending in your annual reports to the Senate or whatever, you're counting the numbers, you're looking at the annual report before the meeting and going, oh, there's less people in worship than there were again. And you're reading the studies out of Pew or Barna or other folks saying that people are less religious. And then you preach about that a lot. Yeah, as somebody who's sitting in the pews a lot, I just sort of sit there going, am I not supposed to be here? Right? If I came over to your house for a party and you said, yeah, lots of people used to come to this party, but people don't come here anymore. Like, cool. Right? I'm not going to eat whatever you're serving because I'm worried about some food poisoning, and maybe I'm just going to go grab something at McDonald's and call it a night. It's easy for us to sort of get sucked into this narrative of decline. The numbers are real things. The realities are there. But when we preach about these numbers and narratives of decline, it gives the sense to people in the pews like myself and others, I suspect, that the church is in decline and doesn't have much to offer. Okay? A different thing is to do some of the things I try to highlight above, is say that, listen, the church is a place that's here to do some soul crafting work. The church is a place where we can stay in relationship with folks who are very different than us. The church is a place where we try and move hearts and souls and minds, and I'm going to do that work over and over again for those of you who are here, and hope you invite some people to come be a part of this. We just had, a couple of days ago, we had Lenny Duncan visiting St. Olaf College. I'm seeing some nodding heads. Some of you have read his book, maybe seen him speaking at events here in Minneapolis and St. Paul and the surrounding environs. And one of the resounding choruses in his book called Dear Church is this attack on the narrative of decline. Right? He says, you Lutherans have talked yourself into this dark space where you've convinced yourself that nobody cares about the main line, nobody cares about Lutherans anymore, and so, why bother? What I think is interesting here is that we are often afraid of political conversations because we're afraid of offending people, right? Like the rich old white guy who has the Blue Lives Matter sticker on his car is going to stop coming to church if I talk about Black Lives Matter, and we can't turn the furnace on anymore if he stops coming. So there's that genuine fear. I feel like we're not afraid, though, of the folks who don't talk to us and say anything. In my limited experience in the parish, I lost a lot more folks who just kind of drifted away than I ever did folks who said that sermon was too political or you're too engaged in social issues. Some folks leave for those reasons, that's clear, but most folks leave out of boredom or distraction. Right? And so part of Duncan's charge, Lenny Duncan's charge to us, I think, is to sort of say, if we're going to go down, let's go down fighting. Right? Let's go down swinging. We don't know sociologically what's going to happen to the Lutheran Church in 25 years, 50 years. I don't know what's going to happen to me in the next week, so that's kind of a standard thing for how life goes. But I do know I can sort of go down fighting and keep doing the best I can and not die before they bury me. So, just a thought. Final point I'll make. I think we need to be open and honest about the diversity of motivations that people have for being a part of Christian communities. I think that we sort of sell people short for the reasons that they're coming to church. There's a tendency to assume people are coming because they're looking for a respite or a place of calm or a place to be refreshed. Some people are coming because they're looking for a place to be agitated, a place to be engaged. They're looking for a place to connect with other parents, with other non-parents, with other widows and widowers. People have all kinds of reasons for coming. For some people, some of those reasons are deeply hungering for political engagement and social vision. And so we need to be feeding those people as much as we're feeding the folks who want to go on youth trips and the folks who want to work at the soup kitchens and the folks who want to give money and effort to a variety of Lutheran outreach activities. All right. Let me conclude by saying I put a lot of things out there, and I'm open to conversation and question about any of those. This is my, again, humble attempt to offer some of my observations on where I see Luther and where I see us as a church. And I'll end by saying just thank you so much for letting me be here with you today, for coming out in this frigid weather and hearing me and talking with me. And I'm excited to now hear and talk with and learn from you. So thank you again.
Wow. What a gift. Thank you so much for this inaugural lecture. We couldn't have asked for more. I really am grateful.